Alright folks, today I'm here once again to bring you my thoughts and feelings on The Walking Dead Dead City Season 2 Episode 5, The Bird Always Knows. Now, I've seen a lot of mixed opinions on this episode online, but admittedly, I had a ton of fun with this installment, and I think it was an improvement over the last. However, there's undoubtedly a lot of issues that mostly stem from execution in my opinion. Starting out with Maggie's side of the episode, as I feel like I have a lot more problems there than with the Brazi. Last episode I mentioned how it was revealed that Ginny was there to kill Negan, which, wasn't really a surprise. However, what I didn't even piece together for some reason was how this revelation sold out Pearlie for lying about killing Negan, which we see followed up on in this episode where Maggie, Pearlie, and Herschel return to the park base only to see Lucia went through with her plan of taking over and imprisoning this innocent group who helped them. Pearlie broke their laws by lying to higher authorities, and Maggie corroborated that lie. So now the two are under arrest for treason against the New Babylon Federation, where Pearlie is then put in a holding cell, but Maggie is tasked with luring Negan and the Croat to their location for an ambush. Now, I know I've said it a few times already, but Lucia is just not a good character. Even Pearlie, who was a stone-cold ranger when we met him last season, has been shown to have a heart, but Lucia is given no backstory for why she acts the way she does and just comes off as completely naive when she should be their leader. First off, again, all of this over a few methane barrels to last a few months still makes absolutely no sense. Second, Lucia refuses to believe Maggie's warnings of the Croats' growing army and even accuses her of lying about how many soldiers he has, even though she personally experienced the full force of an organized attack firsthand and knows the Brazi were hunting them and surrounding the park last episode. She sort of feels like opposition for the sake of opposition. And although she embodies New Babylon's philosophies to a T, nothing about what she's doing makes sense. In her eyes, everything is for the greater good of New Babylon, but New Babylon regularly executes its citizens for the smallest of offenses. Not to mention, she went from an army of 50 to 12 and even lost the Federation's governor, only to act like none of it matters as long as they can feed the population they're so desperate to execute or conscript into another futile war for the next few months. Lucia then takes Herschel Jr. hostage as a way to get Maggie to comply with orders, but at this point, Maggie is as fed up with these guys as I am, and instead attempts to free Pearlie in order to get her son back, only to slam the door back in his face when he doesn't immediately take up arms with her, which I found kind of hilarious. Maggie hasn't really stood out to me this season, but this episode we got to see the mama bear side of her character come out in full force, which led to her nearly killing Lucia, only stopped by Ginny, who raises a gun to Herschel in a classic standoff, forcing Maggie to surrender herself to the marshals and face execution via hanging along with Pearlie. I don't like Ginny at all. I get her burning need to kill Negan, but forcing Herschel to lose his last parent in this situation when she was taken in and given a home by them is wild. Made even worse when you consider it's more than likely Negan was lying about killing her father in order to make her leave the island. But at the climax of the New Babylon side of the episode, we see Lucia hang the Boathouse community's leader for refusing to join their federation. And next up was Maggie. However, before they got the chance to follow through, the park people began their weird ritualistic moaning from episode 3, intending to draw the dead to their location, which leaves the Boathouse grounds completely overrun. And in the chaos, we see basically every remaining unnamed New Babylon soldier fall, and along with them, the park people who sacrificed their lives, half out of following their leader's words, and half out of a desire to stop the executions. The commotion causes Maggie to fall and hang over a walker while Ginny is injured by a tree branch. However, in spite of everything that's unfolded so far this season, Ginny rushes over to save Maggie, probably out of guilt for the damage she's caused, which does buy a bit of respect back, but doesn't excuse putting them all in this situation in the first place. Although what follows is a fantastic scene for Maggie as she violently fights through the herd to reach Lucia, who has taken Herschel hostage. And although I haven't liked her character whatsoever, admittedly Lucia looked pretty badass tanking her way through the walkers one-handed. However, my enjoyment of the scene was severely diminished when the reanimated boathouse leader somehow appeared behind the herd despite dying on the inside of the fence, before viciously biting Lucia in the neck. Personally, I wanted to see Maggie go ballistic on her, but either way, I'm glad she's gone. Although, now that New Babylon is no longer a factor in Manhattan, it seems like this season is going to be shifting away from the pursuit of methane, which kind of makes me feel like this whole extended plot point was done just to get Maggie and the others back on the island. So I really hope we do see consequences for this failed mission in the future. But as Maggie's side of the story comes to a close, we see herself, Ginny, Herschel, and Pearlie taking refuge inside the Foragers' base, where we then get a scene that shines some more light on Herschel's motivations. I was right in the fact that he was never intending to hurt Maggie or his people from the bricks. But what I didn't really consider, because it wasn't really highlighted that much, was Herschel's rage against New Babylon and its completely backwards laws. He was treated well by the Dama, besides the toe thing, so he didn't fully see the evil behind her eyes. And everything she said about what New Babylon was turned out to be true. But that didn't mean he wanted all those people to die, and expresses the guilt he's felt over it. He believed in her vision for the city and didn't see each side as black and white. However, given all the death that's occurred, it seems like he's begun to see the errors in his actions. But that doesn't explain why he went to meet up with her last episode, so there's definitely still a piece missing from this puzzle. However, as the two express their desires to go home now that the New Babylon stuff is over, a knock at the door reveals Bruegel and his men coming to recruit them for what seems like a double cross against Negan and the Croat. I am really intrigued with the change in direction this season has suddenly taken, but again, I hope there are severe consequences to the failed mission with methane and it doesn't just fall into irrelevance. Ginny's injury may come off as a cheap way to make you sympathize with her, but if I were to guess, they're gonna have her encounter Negan nearing death only to have him save her and confess the truth of why he said what he did. But regardless, the Brazzi side of the episode is where I really found my enjoyment this week, as the focus was mostly on the Croat and his complex relationship with the Dama. This episode begins with a simple yet amazing shot of 6th Avenue lit up as a single walker wanders by. Just the visual of a walker shuffling by a functioning traffic light alone makes me love the concept of power returning. But the point of the scene was to show a mysterious group sabotaging the electrical boxes and powering down the street in order to make the Brazzi look weak. What follows is a really interesting scene where we begin to see the disproportionate levels of respect between the Dama and Croat, as her power truly only comes from his loyalty to her, which she either doesn't see or doesn't want him to see. His feelings are represented through a rat in a maze, as the Croat is just her puppet in this game, and although he knows of the unfair balance in respect and credit, he struggles to defy her out of genuine loyalty for the position she's put him in. Even when she does something as petty as making fun of him for a jacket he was proud to wear. And in the beginning, I found myself pretty bored with the idea of seeing Negan persuade yet another group of psychos for the whole episode. But I was pleasantly surprised to see a more nuanced take on these survivors, as Christos is shown to actually be a respectable man protecting children within his compound. He also gives us further insight into Bruegel, as we learn this collective of survivors lost everything they had to betting on his games, including their weapons, supplies, and even home, which we know from last episode was always rigged, so I'm glad we got to see the effects of Bruegel's ways on others. However, as Negan begins to find common ground with Christos and nearly reaches a deal for his men to join their fight, the Croat suddenly appears, accusing Christos of sabotaging the 6th Street power station as he found one of their knives under the electrical box, which admittedly is pretty convenient given the whole point of the mission was stealth, but leads to a fitting punishment in his eyes as he releases the methane into the air, causing Christos and his men to pass out and shortly after, meet their ends against both Negan and the Dama's instructions. Although he doesn't kill the women or children, as he ironically claims to not be a monster. I was actually really interested in getting to know Christos after we found out he was protecting the people he loved. But as we know with these spin-offs, not all, but most new characters who weren't featured in the main series have an expiration date of like 10 episodes, which has been one of my biggest issues with this era. The Croat could feel his influence slipping despite being the brains behind the operation, and this was the first time we've seen him do what he thought was best for their mission outside of the Dama's influence. But Negan could see this resentment building as well as he attempts to goad him into defying her by saying out loud what he already knew but didn't want to accept, which somewhat works as the Croat lashes out on the Dama when reprimanded for killing Christos' group. I love the line where the Croat acknowledges how she treats him like her rat, but even worse as there's no reward for him at the end, which I think perfectly summed up their relationship. However, to Negan, turning the two on each other was the only way he could think to protect his family in the long run. So later, after disbanding the meeting, the Dama would discover her rat ground up on the floor in what she believed was a sign of defiance from the Croat, telling her his old ways of acting as a pawn in her game were dead, as Negan knew he needed to push a little harder to break their trust in each other. So as the Croat comes to her door to apologize and hash things out, the Dama confronts him, believing he was responsible for the threat. And although he wasn't guilty of this particular crime, he reaches a breaking point and finally tells her exactly what we've all been thinking. How her power stems from him, which causes her to bite him in the hand, which was kind of foreshadowed in the previous episode. But while attempting to get her off, the Croat had accidentally knocked the Dama into a methane-fueled lamp which traps her under and ignites around. And instead of helping as she screams for him by his real name, Melee, the Croat's internal conflict boils over as he just watches her in what looks like both regret and relief before leaving her behind. I know the next episode promo states the Dama is dead, but I have to admit something about the way it was portrayed gave me the impression she may survive this incident, but come out severely injured. Honestly, I'm kind of 50-50 on which way this is leaning. On one hand, this would give the Croat full power over the Brazi and propel his character in a brand new direction. The same goes for Negan, as he would no longer fear her threats with his family given she was dead, possibly leaving him in a real position of power rather than just a puppet or figurehead, whether he chooses to stick with it or not. But if she were to survive, depending on how the Croat now views their relationship, he could become her dog more than ever as he could feel guilty over his actions. Or hell, maybe it would just straight up lead to his death, but I really hope not. All I know for sure is that she would be 10 times crazier now than she was before. I wasn't really over the moon about the Dama as a character, but her dying here kinda feels a bit weird considering the dynamic set up between Herschel and herself. I don't know, I was really expecting some sort of big plot twist with those two, but if she is actually dead and Herschel really did confess everything, then I guess that's that, but again, it just feels kind of off. I think I'm just gonna have to wait and see how the rest of this season plays out to determine if I like this alleged death or not. The Croat is my favorite character in this series, so I'm glad he appears to be getting more to do, but that ending scene with Negan smiling after manipulating the situation sort of tells me Melee is just replacing the Dama as his puppet master with Negan. But whichever way this goes, I am intrigued. However, I do kind of wish the Croat's personal dissatisfaction in his dynamic with the Dama was explored a little more over the course of the last few episodes. You could definitely tell these thoughts were brewing, but I think it could have been set up a little more blatantly to prevent his shift from feeling a bit sudden. But for what it is, I think it works for the story. This episode probably had the most happen in the season so far and really shook up the status quo of what we've been following. New Babylon is no longer a current threat to Maggie while they're on the island, and they are now being ushered into the politics of Manhattan through Bruegel. And if the Dama really is dead, the whole situation with Herschel now becomes a huge question mark, but leaves the Brazi open to a multitude of directions to go. At this point, I'm kind of lost on where this season is going to end in a good way. And with where the story's currently at right now, the only thing I'd say I'm outright disappointed with is the predictability of most new era characters dying sooner rather than later, which is an issue I've discussed in the past. 3, potentially 4 notable losses is a tad overkill in my opinion, and at this rate, I'd be shocked if anybody makes it through the season that isn't named Maggie or Negan. But regardless, I'm extremely curious to hear your thoughts on this episode in the comments down below. If I were to rate this installment, I think I'd give it a 7.5 out of 10. I can't help but appreciate just how much the story moved forward, even if some things could have been executed a bit better. And although there were some problems, I did enjoy myself all the way through, and I can't wait to see how the story ends off. But that is gonna do it for me today, folks. I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I'll see you in the next review.